In the spring of 2017, a county extension agent named Dale Pruitt stood in the doorway of Chet Hoover's equipment barn in Harlan County, Nebraska, and said the words Chet had been hearing in one form or another for the better part of 30 years. He said them the way a man says something he has said so many times that saying it has become indistinguishable from breathing. He looked at the rows of white wooden hive boxes stacked too deep along the tree line, at the clover patches Chet left uncut along the fence rows, at the absence of any herbicide sprayer in the yard, and he said, "Chet, this is a hobby. A nice hobby, but it isn't agriculture." Then came June of 2019, when a food safety auditor from the state lab in Lincoln drove out to the same farm on a follow-up visit and handed Chet a single sheet of paper. She had driven 40 miles because she wanted to deliver it in person. The number on that sheet, the residue figure from the statewide honey sample sweep, was 0.0 parts per billion. Not below the threshold, not within tolerance. 0. Not a trace of neonicotinoid, not a ghost of glyphosate, not the faintest signature of any systemic pesticide in any jar Chet Hoover had pulled from any hive on his property. Every other honey producer in Harlan County had failed at least one category. 2 operations had failed all 4. Chet's was the only honey that passed the test. Between those 2 moments stretches a story worth telling carefully, because it is not really a story about bees. It is a story about what it costs to know one piece of ground well enough that you can hear it change, and about the kind of knowing that no certification program has yet figured out how to issue a credential for. Chet Hoover was 61 years old in 2017, and he was known for 2 things in Harlan County. He was known for being quiet in a way that made agricultural meeting rooms uncomfortable, because his quiet was not the quiet of a man with nothing to say. It was the quiet of a man who had already decided and who understood that no one in the room was going to change his mind, and who did not consider that a problem worth discussing. He was also known for his honey, not in a commercial sense. Chet sold roughly 200 jars a year at the Alma Farmers Market and gave away another 100 to neighbors. He ran 42 hives on 180 acres of mixed ground, about 2/3 row crop in corn-soy rotation, and 1/3 pasture and remnant prairie he kept the plow out of as a matter of principle. The principle was his grandfather's, passed down in the form of a field observation notebook that sat on the shelf above the kitchen table. Its leather cover, so dark from handling it, looked almost black. Dale Pruitt was 38, had a master's degree in agronomy from the University of Nebraska, and drove a white university-branded pickup that never showed mud on the tires because he tended to park at the edge of fields rather than enter them. He was not a bad man. He was, in fact, exactly what a good extension agent is supposed to be, genuinely concerned with the financial sustainability of the operations he advised, fluent in the most current research literature, and equipped with economic models that showed clearly what yields per acre a properly managed corn-soy rotation could achieve under modern input programs. The models were accurate. Dale believed in them the way a careful man believes in arithmetic, and arithmetic had never failed him in any way he could see from where he stood. The county was deep in the shift to pre-emergent herbicide programs by 2017. It had been coming for a decade, the steady conversion of fence rows and ditch margins and headlands to clean ground, the elimination of the weedy, flowering borders that old-timers had left because old-timers had not known any better. The agronomy case for the conversion was real. Cleaner ground meant less competition, and less competition meant higher yields on the rotation acres. The herbicide products were registered, tested, and approved. The neonicotinoid seed treatments had been in standard use for nearly 15 years. Every agronomist in the extension system had the same recommendation, and across 3 counties the ground was responding to it the way the models said it would. The meeting where Dale laid out the data was held in the basement of the Harlan County Extension Office in February of 2017. A long, low room with folding tables and a projector screen that always tilted slightly to the left. 43 operators attended, which was a good turnout for a February meeting. Dale's slides showed yield comparison data from 6-year trials in 3 Nebraska counties, with and without pre-emergent programs. The numbers were real and the margins were meaningful, between 4 and 9 bushels per acre on corn, and nobody in the room had the luxury of looking at 4 bushels per acre and deciding they did not need it. Chet sat in the 3rd row and said nothing through the presentation. He said nothing during the question period, which ran 20 minutes and covered application timing, product costs, and whether the county average data would apply to ground that was lighter in the northwest corners of the township. When the meeting was breaking up and people were pulling on coats, Dale saw Chet still sitting and came over, carrying his laptop under one arm. He asked Chet whether the pre-emergent program was something he would consider for his corn ground. Chet said he had bees on the fence rows. Dale said he understood that, and that there were buffer zone protocols that could be observed, and that the research on pollinator effects from properly applied pre-emergent programs showed impacts well within acceptable parameters. He said it the way a man says something he has said many times and found to be true each time he has checked. Chet said the bees did not work inside buffer zone protocols. Dale looked at him for a moment and then smiled, not unkindly. Chet, I know you love those hives, but a hobby shouldn't be driving your agronomic decisions on row crop ground. 2 other operators were listening by then, coats half on. Nobody said anything. Chet stood up, picked up his cap from the chair beside him, and went home. He went home and opened the old notebook to the page where his grandfather, a man named Orvis Hoover, who had come to Harlan County from western Iowa in 1931, had written a single sentence at the top of an observation page. Where the fence row flowers, the hive builds surplus. Orvis had written it in 1952 after a drought year in which his bees had survived on clover and wild aster, and his neighbor's bees, bought from a commercial supplier, had largely collapsed. The sentence was not agronomy. It was not peer-reviewed. It would not have survived a day in Dale Pruitt's literature database. It was accurate, and it was Chet's inheritance. Let me tell you what Chet Hoover understood about honeybees, that the standard agricultural model in 2017 did not have a good way to measure. A honeybee colony is, in practical terms, a foraging organism with a radius. In a healthy agricultural landscape, that radius is roughly 2 miles. Everything a hive produces over the course of a season is a direct function of what exists within that circle, in terms of pollen and nectar diversity, in terms of the number of distinct flowering species available across the season's length, and in terms of what chemical loads those flowers carry. A colony kept inside a monoculture corn-soy system, even a healthy one, is a colony foraging on perhaps 4 or 5 distinct flowering sources across an entire season, 2 of which are crop species that bloom for roughly 2 weeks total. The remaining forage comes from whatever the field margins allow. In a county running aggressive pre-emergent programs, the field margins were being cleaned to bare ground in the name of yield efficiency, which meant the foraging radius was being hollowed out from the inside. Chet knew this not because he had read it anywhere, though by 2017 the research literature was beginning to accumulate. He knew it because Orvis had tracked it in the notebook. Orvis had charted colony weight gain across seasons beginning in 1948, recording it every 10 days on a hanging scale he built himself, and the correlation between the range of flowering species he could identify within a mile of the hives and the weight of honey pulled at extraction was consistent enough across 20 years of his records that Chet treated it as settled fact. He had continued the records himself. The notebook ran to 3 volumes by the time Dale Pruitt made his visit. There is a second thing the Standard Model did not measure well, which is what happens to a honeybee colony when the pollen it collects is chemically contaminated. Pollen is not just fuel. It is the sole source of protein for developing brood, the material from which nurse bees synthesize the glandular secretions they feed to larvae. When foragers bring back pollen from flowers treated with systemic pesticides, those chemicals move into the brood cell. They move into the bodies of nurse bees. The effects on adult bee navigation and learning that neonicotinoids produce at sublethal doses had been documented in European research literature since 2012. The effects on developing brood were less visible and harder to count, which was part of why the American regulatory picture lagged. What you could count was colony population decline across a season, and what Chet's weight logs showed was that his colonies gained weight consistently from April through October, while the county average for operations using standard input programs had been flat or declining since 2014. Orvis had not known about neonicotinoids. He had not known the mechanism by which floral diversity translated into colony health. What he knew was that his bees did better when more things were blooming near the hives, and that this was true consistently enough across enough seasons to be a rule rather than a coincidence. He had written that observation in 1952, and he had been adding to the evidence for it every year until he died in 1979, when Chet was 23, and had already been keeping his own weight records for 6 years. The memory Chet carried most clearly from those years was of standing with Orvis on a September morning in 1974, watching the goldenrod along the creek draw come into its last flush of the season. Orvis had a jar of honey in his hand, late summer extraction, darker than the spring honey and sharper on the tongue. He held it up to the light and said that the goldenrod was what put that color in it, that you could taste what was blooming if you knew how to pay attention. He was not speaking poetically. He meant it as a measurement. The honey was a record of the landscape, and if you read honey the way you read a soil test, you could understand what your ground was doing in ways a yield figure per acre could never tell you. Chet had not forgotten that. He had also not found a way to say it to Dale Pruitt that Dale Pruitt would have recognized as data. The fence rows Chet kept were not accidental. They were planted. Along 4,200 linear feet of boundary ground, he had established successive bloom, starting with Dutch white clover from April through frost, then Alsike clover, then sweet clover that stood 4 feet tall in August and carried a scent you could track from the road, then wild bergamot and prairie clover on the remnant ground that did not bloom until late summer, when everything in the county rotation had finished. He had added goldenrod corridors along 2 creek draws in 2009 and phacelia strips in the headlands of 2 fields in 2014. The phacelia specifically because a graduate student doing a bee diversity study at the county's only preserved prairie remnant had told him it was the single highest value pollen source for honeybee brood production per square foot of any annual he could plant. Chet had gone home and planted it the following spring. He had not needed a degree to act on correct information when he heard it. His neighbor to the east was a man named Gary Weld. Gary was 54, had farmed the same ground his own father had worked, and had made every correct financial decision. An efficient Harlan County operator was supposed to make between 2005 and 2017. He had financed a new grain bin complex in 2011, a new 16-row planter in 2013, a GPS-guided variable rate applicator in 2016, and was carrying roughly $340,000 in operating debt serviced by a corn-soy rotation running at county average yields. His fence rows had come out in 2014 as part of a custom spraying package that promised cleaner ground and 15 additional acres of productive row crop. Gary was a good farmer and a careful one. He had made exactly the investments his bank, his agronomists, and the available data said a well-run operation should make, and in 2017 his books were tight but defensible. Gary kept bees too, in a small way. 6 hives along his east fence line, purchased from a commercial supplier in 2015, managed with the standard treatment calendar his county extension newsletter recommended. They produced modest honey, enough for the family and a few jars for neighbors. He did not have scales. He did not have records. He had bees the way a lot of farm families kept bees, as a pleasant addition to the place, not a tract operation. The spring of 2018 arrived after a wet fall and a hard winter, and with it came a spray season that Dale Pruitt later described at a regional meeting as the most aggressive he had seen in 20 years of extension work. Commodity prices had been soft for 3 years, and the pressure to maximize yield on every acre was intense enough that operators who had left some headland cover were trimming it, and operators who had already cleaned their fence rows were treating the draws and creek margins they had previously left. The herbicide loads went up across the county. The neonicotinoid seed treatment acreage expanded because corn prices made every acre of clean, productive ground look like a rational investment. Chet did not spray his fence rows. He did not change the planting schedule. He replaced the sweet clover strips that winter had thinned and put in an additional half-acre of phacelia along the south border of the remnant prairie. He did it in April while the county was running sprayers, and if he was aware of the contrast, he did not say so to anyone. Remy, his 3-year-old black and tan shepherd mix, walked the fence lines with him the day he put the phacelia seed in, the way she walked every inspection he made through the hives, patient and unhurried, staying outside the flight paths, the way a dog learns to do when she has grown up among bees. His granddaughter Willa came home that summer. She was 23, had finished a degree in environmental science at Colorado State, and had accepted a position with a conservation nonprofit that would not start until September. She came home for 3 months in part to help, and in part, though she would not have said it this way, because she was not certain the position was what she wanted. She had written her senior thesis on pollinator habitat loss in the Great Plains. She had read, in the preparation of that thesis, most of the current peer-reviewed literature on neonicotinoid effects on bee cognition and colony health. She understood the science better than almost anyone in Harlan County, and when she arrived in June and walked the fence rows with her grandfather, she had a complicated feeling she could not immediately account for. Willa had not expected the fence rows to look like that. She had expected Chet's operation to be the kind of well-intentioned, small-scale thing that the research showed was insufficient to the scale of the problem. A few hives, some scattered clover, a pleasant hobby. What she found was something different. The succession planning was deliberate and sequenced. The bloom calendar was gapless from April through October. The hive weights, recorded in the notebook with the same regularity Orvis had maintained, showed colony populations and honey surplus figures that were an anomaly by any standard she knew how to apply. She sat at the kitchen table the second evening and read through the weight logs without saying anything for a long time. "How long has it been like this?" she said finally. 40 years of my records," Chet said. Orvis went back to 48. She picked up the notebook and looked at the handwriting. 2 generations of it in 2 different inks, the older entries in a careful cursive she could barely read. She set it back down and did not say what she had been about to say, which was something about scale and peer review and the limits of anecdotal data. She went to bed instead and came back to the hives the next morning. That same summer, Gary Weld lost 4 of his 6 colonies. It happened in 2 weeks in late June, beginning about 10 days after the last pre-emergent spray pass on the county's largest operator, whose ground abutted Gary's north fence line. Gary noticed it first as a change in flight activity, the hives quieter than they should have been on warm mornings, fewer foragers coming and going. He opened the first hive on a Friday and found what beekeepers call a shotgun brood pattern, cells capped and uncapped in no sequence, larvae dying before they could close, the nurse bee population thin and disorganized in a way that meant something had gone wrong in the colony's fundamental capacity to function. He lost that hive by Sunday. 3 more followed in the next 10 days. Gary was not a careless man, and he was not looking for someone to blame. He had followed every recommendation in the Extension newsletter. He had applied the treatments on the schedule. What he had not done and had not known to do was establish any forage buffer between his hives and the sprayed ground to his north, because no one in the Extension system had told him that was a variable worth managing. He brought it up at a coffee stop in Alma that July, at the table in the back where 6 operators gathered most weekday mornings between 7 and 8. 2 of the others had similar stories. One had lost 8 of 12 colonies. The other had not kept bees in several years and had noticed the wild bee activity on his property had declined to the point he was now worried about his pumpkin acreage. That last detail did not register the way it should have, not yet. Nobody at the table connected it to pollination service or to the broader foraging ecology of the county. They talked about it as a bee problem, not a landscape problem, and moved on to corn futures. Dale Pruitt heard about the colony losses. He was, to his credit, concerned. He reached out to the state apiarist's office and learned that colony loss reports had been elevated across 3 counties that summer. He visited Gary Weld's remaining hives and collected samples for the state lab. He drove out to Chet Hoover's farm in August, partly because Chet's operation was the largest apiary in the county, and he wanted comparable samples, and partly, he would later admit, because he was surprised to hear that Chet's colonies were intact. Chet was pulling a super when Dale arrived, moving the way a beekeeper moves when bees are calm and the work is familiar, hands slow, smoke light. Remy sat in the shade of the equipment barn, watching. Dale stood at the edge of the apiary and said, with genuine puzzlement rather than condescension, that he didn't understand why Chet's colonies were not showing what Gary's had shown. "Because mine aren't eating what Gary's ate," Chet said. He set the super down and walked Dale through the fence row calendar, the species list, the weight logs. Dale listened with the particular attention of a man who has been trained to hear data and knows he is being given some. He asked about the Phacelia. He had not heard of planting it deliberately for bees. He wrote the name in his notebook and circled it. He walked the full south border strip with Chet and looked at the density of the planting and at the forager activity along the strip, which was visible even in August. Bees working the late Phacelia blooms in steady, unhurried lines, the flight paths to the hive boxes clear and purposeful. He took photographs of the bloom strips with his phone. Willa was near the far fence row when this happened, pulling clover volunteers from the headland edge of the south field. She watched Dale walk with her grandfather, and watched Dale photograph the Phacelia and write things in his notebook. And she had a feeling she could not precisely name, something between vindication and impatience, watching the credentialed world encounter evidence it did not yet have a category for. Dale stood at the edge of the Phacelia strip for a long moment before he said anything. When he did speak, he said the operation was genuinely impressive, and he meant it. He said he could see the forager activity was different from what he was seeing on the sampled operations, and that he had no good explanation for it yet from within his existing models. Then he said the thing that was still true within his framework, the thing he had been saying in one form or another for more than 10 years. He said the data he could take back to Lincoln was anecdotal in the technical sense, that he would want to see a controlled, replicated study before he could carry this into extension recommendations, and that what Chet had built might be an anomaly of his specific ground or his specific genetics rather than a generalizable system. "You'll see what you'll see," Chet said, and went back to the hives. "Let me tell you what happened that fall, because what happened that fall was the first time the story began to be told in numbers rather than impressions." The state apiarist's office, responding to the elevated colony loss reports, applied for an emergency survey grant in September 2018 and received it. The survey was designed by a team from the university's entomology department, and it covered 6 counties in south-central Nebraska. The protocol called for honey samples from every registered commercial and semi-commercial apiary in the survey area, tested against a panel of 47 pesticide residue categories, plus full colony health assessments including brood pattern, adult bee population, and varroa mite load. It was the most comprehensive honey safety survey the state had conducted in 18 years. The survey team arrived in Harlan County in early October. They drove a state vehicle, 2 entomologists and a lab technician, and they moved through the county's registered apiaries on a systematic schedule. They sampled 12 operations. They performed colony assessments on 7. The operations with the worst colony losses had already shut down or reduced to the point there was not much to assess. Chet's operation was the second they visited, and the lead researcher, a woman named Dr. Sarah Bauer from the University Extension Service, spent 2 hours walking the fence rows before she would let anyone open a hive. She had a clipboard and a species identification guide, and she kept stopping at the fence row to crouch down and look at things. She had the same initial reaction Willa had had in June, the same recalibration of expectation, though she expressed it as a rapid series of questions rather than a silence. She asked about the Phacelia yield per linear foot, the bloom sequencing rationale, the weight log methodology, the scale calibration procedure Orvis had used. She asked how many species Chet could identify along the south border without consulting a guide. He named 11 without pausing. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "Who else knows you're doing this?" "Nobody asked," Chet said. She photographed the notebook and every page she could get the lens square to in the field light. She asked if she could borrow it to scan properly back in Lincoln. Chet said she could take it. He also told her about the 2 subsequent volumes he had kept himself, in spiral-bound ledgers on the shelf beside it, with his own observations added in the margins. She drove back to Lincoln with all 3. Willa had watched the exchange from the equipment barn doorway. She called Dr. Bauer the following week, identified herself as Chet's granddaughter, and a recent environmental science graduate, and asked if she could see the methodology protocol for the residue analysis. Dr. Bauer sent it that afternoon. By November, Willa had deferred the conservation job start indefinitely and was corresponding regularly with the entomology department about the survey timeline. The results came in June 2019. The state lab processed 340 honey samples. They ran each sample against the 47 residue panel. When the summary data came back to the survey team, it showed what anyone paying attention might have suspected, but few had documented this cleanly. Every operation in the survey counties that ran standard integrated pest management programs with neonicotinoid seed treatments on adjacent or owned ground showed detectable residue levels in at least 2 pesticide categories. The thresholds for human safety were not exceeded in most cases. The state was not issuing warnings about honey safety. The results were being compiled for a research publication, not a public health bulletin. Chet's samples showed nothing. 47 categories. 3 sample sets, each from a different extraction date. 0 detectable residues across all of them. Dr. Bauer drove out to deliver the result in person on a Tuesday morning in the second week of June 2019. She had called ahead, which Chet appreciated. She brought a printed summary, bound with a binder clip, and a single-page extract she had prepared specifically for him, showing his figures alongside the county averages in a simple 2-column table. She sat at the kitchen table, where the old notebook now lived on the shelf above, and she set both papers on the table, and she was quiet for a moment before she spoke. She said, "This is what 40 years of the fence row calendar looks like in a residue test." Willa was there. She had driven from Denver the week before, after Dr. Bauer had called to say the results were in, and asked if Willa would want to be present. She was on her second cup of coffee and had been trying not to ask Dr. Bauer the question she had been asking since November. She looked at the paper when Dr. Bauer put it down. She picked it up and read it twice, slowly. Chet looked at it. He did not pick it up. He looked at it on the table for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he has been telling himself for 30 years was true, and is now looking at the proof that it was. His hands were flat on the table, and he did not move them. Remy lay at his feet under the chair, the way she always lay in the kitchen in the mornings, and the kitchen was quiet enough that you could hear the bees working the Dutch white clover outside the window, the low, steady sound of a hive in good health. Chet turned the paper face down on the table. He stood up and poured Dr. Bauer a cup of coffee. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say anything about Dale Pruitt. He asked Dr. Bauer if she had eaten breakfast. The number was 0.0 parts per billion. It occupied its own silence when you read it. Not a trace of neonicotinoid, not a ghost of glyphosate, not the faintest metabolite of any of the 47 compounds the panel had screened for. In a market where honey residue certification had become a serious selling point in the European import chain, in a period when specialty buyers were beginning to require documentation that very few American producers in row crop country could supply, a 0 residue figure across all 47 categories was not a modest result. It was a document. It was, as Dr. Bauer wrote in the research paper, she submitted that fall to the Journal of the Entomological Society of America. The first fully documented 0 residue result from a commercially productive apiary operating in a predominantly row crop-dominated landscape anywhere in the state's published survey history. She asked Chet for permission to cite the weight logs by name. He said that was fine. Willa sat with that paper for a long time after Dr. Bauer left. She read it through a third time. Not the numbers this time, but the column headers. the 47 compound names in their chemical shorthand running down the left margin of the page. Each one represented a pathway by which what happened in a field could end up in what someone ate. Each one was a category that Chet's hives had come back 0 on. She went out to the hives in the late afternoon. Remy followed her through the clover strips, the way the dog had followed Chet through every inspection Willa could remember, patient and wide of the flight paths. The goldenrod along the creek draw was in its late summer flush, the deep yellow of it catching the low light in a way that made the draw look warmer than the surrounding fields. The Phacelia strip had seeded itself back with enough density that it would not need replanting for another season. The sweet clover along the south fence was still carrying late blooms, the scent of it moving in the warm evening air toward the hive boxes. She stood at the edge of the hive row and watched the foragers coming in. The last flight of the long day, bees loaded with pollen in shades she could now mostly identify by color, pale yellow for the Dutch white, orange for the Phacelia, a deeper gold she associated with the goldenrod. Her thesis had been about landscape-scale habitat loss. It had used satellite imagery and population models and geographic information systems. It had been, she now understood, a document about what was disappearing, assembled at a scale where you could not see what remained. What her grandfather had was something her thesis had not found a way to measure. It was not the absence of the problem. It was the presence of a solution that had been running quietly and without announcement since 1948. She did not take the conservation job. She wrote to the nonprofit that week and declined, and she wrote to Dr. Bauer the same day to ask whether there was a graduate position available in the entomology department for someone with her background who wanted to study the fence row calendar at a scale that could be published and replicated. There was. Dale Pruitt read Dr. Bauer's paper when it was published in a regional entomology journal the following spring. He read it twice. He called Chet in March of 2020 and asked if he could come out. He said he wanted to walk the fence rows with the bloom calendar in hand. He said he had a question about the Phacelia planting rate he did not know how to answer from the paper. Chet said he was welcome to come. They walked the fence rows for 2 hours on a cold morning, with the clover barely showing. Chet had the notebook and Dale had a legal pad. Dale took 7 pages of notes. At the end of the walk, standing at the edge of the creek draw where the goldenrod would not rise for another 3 months, Dale said the thing that was hardest for him to say, which was that he had been recommending against this kind of margin management for 20 years based on yield efficiency models that had not accounted for what those margins were doing to the foraging ecology of the surrounding landscape. He did not apologize in so many words. He asked instead if Chet thought the fence row approach was teachable to operators who had already cleaned their ground. Ground comes back, Chet said. Takes a few years. Dale put that in the legal pad and underlined it. He wrote a co-authored extension bulletin that went out to Harlan and 3 neighboring counties in the fall of 2020, recommending Phacelia and sweet clover margins for operations adjacent to or managing apiaries, citing Chet's weight records and the residue data directly. The bulletin cited the Bauer study and named the bloom sequencing protocol by the informal name it had acquired in the entomology department, which they called the Hoover calendar. Gary Weld was one of the first operators in the county to call Chet after the bulletin went out. He had rebuilt his hive count to 4, working from a nucleus colony Chet had given him in the spring. He came out on a Saturday, and Chet walked him through the clover, planning the same way Orvis had walked him through it, pointing to the ground and explaining what was there and what needed to go in and why the sequence mattered as much as the species. Gary was a good listener when he was not being asked to agree with something. He planted 1,800 linear feet of sweet clover and Dutch white along his fence rows the following April, and Phacelia in the headlands of his two closest fields to the remaining hives. That same fall, 4 other operators in the county made similar plantings. 2 of them were from the group that had been at the coffee stop in Alma in 2017 when Gary mentioned his colony losses. One of them had kept no bees for 3 years and was starting again, ordering a nucleus colony from the same supplier Orvis had used in the 1950s, a family operation 3 counties west that had never gone commercial. Chet sold them planting mixes at cost and answered questions on the phone when they had them. He did not offer opinions on their rotation decisions. He told them what the notebook said about bloom timing and what his own record showed about weight gain responses, and he let that be enough. Willa rebuilt the 3-volume notebook into a digital record, scanning every page at the county library with a flatbed scanner and entering the weight observations into a spreadsheet that Dr. Bauer's graduate student used as the data set for a follow-up paper on long-term colony productivity in diversified forage landscapes. The paper listed Orvis Hoover in the acknowledgments. Willa's name was on the paper. She was enrolled in a graduate program at Nebraska by that point, studying landscape-scale pollinator habitat design. She had deferred it a year to work the hives through 1 full season and learn the bloom calendar by walking it rather than reading about it. Chet did not expand the operation. He was asked more than once whether he would consider licensing the calendar methodology or managing a consultation service for other operators. He declined each time without long explanation. He had 180 acres, 42 hives, and a fence row system that the ground could sustain at its current scale. He did not need it to be larger to know what it was worth. The notebook went back on the shelf above the kitchen table when Willa finished scanning it. Orvis's first entry from April of 1948 was a species count, 14 distinct flowering plants identified within a half-mile of the original hives. The last entry Chet had made before handing it to Dr. Bauer was from August 2018, and the count was 27 species. He had added to the list every time he planted something new and confirmed it bloomed. The count was not in any bulletin or any paper. It was in the margin of a page dated 1968 in Orvis's handwriting, where Orvis had noted a count of 16 species and written underneath it, "Add 2 more this spring." Chet had added the count of 27 in his own hand, in the margin below his grandfather's, and left space beneath it. Remy was old now, slower on the fence row walks, her muzzle white from the nose to the brow. She still came. She still sat outside the flight paths with the same patience she had learned as a puppy, watching the hives the way a good working animal watches everything it has spent a life attending to, without hurry, without conclusion, without any need for the thing to be different than it is. There are 2 ways to know a piece of ground. One is to model it, to measure what can be measured, to optimize what the model says can be improved, and to trust that the residual is noise. The other is to stay on it long enough that it tells you things the model cannot hold. One of these ways scales. One of these ways endures. Dale Pruitt was not a bad man for believing in the first, and the second is not wisdom, so much as it is patience made specific to a place. The fence rows that Orvis planted in 1948 fed colonies that produced honey with no detectable residue in 2019, and that is the arithmetic of a kind of knowledge that does not fit on a spreadsheet, but is nonetheless exact. What is rigid breaks when the season turns. What is tended, season after season, in one specific piece of ground, by people who stayed long enough to understand it, leaves something behind that outlasts the model. Chet Hoover knew that. Orvis Hoover knew it before him. And now, on a morning in early spring with the Dutch clover barely showing through the last of the frost, a young woman walked the fence rows of a farm in Harlan County with a notebook in her hand, adding to a count that had been running since 1948, making space at the bottom of the page for whoever comes next.